Chapter 3.8, Part 1, The Modern Aesthetic, Realism to Expressionism. So we have a lot of isms happening here at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. So just keep that in mind. A lot of changes are afoot. We have the Industrial Revolution in full swing, and we have railways and steamships, industrial growth, urban development, expanding middle class, and the invention of photography. So the 19th century is really when the Industrial Revolution gets into full swing, and the railways change the way goods and services are delivered, raw materials, what have you, because the trains can reach more and more areas, and they're being built. Bigger networks of them are being built all the time. Steamships, same thing. You're able to get across the Great Lakes for one thing, and the Mississippi River up and down there. Industrial growth, you're seeing a lot more factories being built, and urban development. So we're moving out of the farms in a big way and into the city, and it's changing things a lot. We're getting a bigger middle class because people are not just working on their farms, and they have some disposable income and a little more time. Some of the conditions are quite brutal just the same, but in some cases we have more leisure time. There's also the invention of photography. So artists begin to respond and make work that has to do with these changes, and in some ways embracing these changes or commenting on them in a positive way, and in other ways, reacting against them, or rebelling a little bit. And we've kind of seen each generation or each ism sort of reacts to the last one and sort of turns away from it a little bit, or finds issue with it, or wants to reinvent something because it's getting too set in its ways, put it that way. Things like abstraction start to happen a little bit later with the Expressionists, and that's partly to do, and the Impressionists a little bit in a kind of a way as well, because, for one thing, we have photography to do the job of capturing an exact image that's realistic. Now the Impressionists are freed up to do other things. That's a super simplified explanation. And then conveying moods or emotions. And remember that our art academies, these are still around. 1660s is when they started in France, and it's kind of a carryover of the Renaissance and Baroque artists who are showing classical, Greek, and Roman themes, and realistic imagery, just hyper-realistic imagery, and history paintings, paintings that are glorifying emperors and things like that, and also portraits, that too. But they're really important because they really governed what artists produced, because they were supporting, some financial support was being given. Because remember, we shift from the Renaissance, and before that, artists were in court. They were employed basically by a king or a queen, or they had a patron such as the Medicis that supported them and gave them money. And then as time goes on, the academies, which operate kind of like schools, kind of, we're in one as we speak. You are a member of an academy to a degree, where you are at a school and you learn from other artists, and those artists show their work, and so on. So anyway, the salon is the showing aspect of once a year of the academy, which are the schools, but they're government-sponsored institutions. They're schools kind of loosely, yes and no. Modern artists decide to break with that tradition because they're finding it too rigid and not allowing them to explore and experiment. So we have this piece from 1863, and we have our neoclassicism hanging on it here, and we're showing the birth of Venus, and there's so many things here, but the basic thing is we have a mythological or a sometimes historical. This isn't historical because the birth of Venus is something that is a Greek myth. We don't know exactly, a time or anything like that. But she's done in this realistic style. The flesh is quite realistic. We don't have quite as hard of an edge or a hard line on this as we do with a lot of neoclassicism, but just the same. Very realistically rendered waves, atmospheric perspective. The island or land back here is fading away and fuzzier and bluer, and then more detail in the foreground, right? The putti, which are mostly we see these in the Renaissance, but the little male angels, we see them, and romanticized version of a woman. Now, a little bit of what we get into too here, we start to get into more of a feminist discussion, but it's not exactly labeled as that in this way at this time. But what it is, and when we get into Manaix, we're going to compare it to this other painting. But we're able to look at, she's not really looking at us, right? So we're able to look at this nude woman, and this was sold to a male patron. I think actually Napoleon bought this, or is it Napoleon the Third? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. You have to look in the book. But this was kind of the thing that men would buy, much like they would buy a nude photograph of a woman now. Okay, so it was a little bit toward pornography in a sense that it was inviting men to look upon this woman. She's not confronting them. She's open, wide open, showing herself and not confronting in any way, right? So we're allowed to have this male gaze and enjoy ourselves, if we're men, and look at this woman who's not going to confront us in any way. So it's an academic piece. This was praised by our critics in the Salon of 1863. She's on full display. She's submissive to the viewer's gaze. Our author puts it much better. And she's accompanied by these naked putti. So the Salon is praising all this detail in this painting. Now we switch to Edward Manet in 1863. He is rejected from the Salon, and he gets kicked out, and he's in the Academy, and he gets kicked out for this painting because it has a lot of challenges toward the Academy, whether he meant it or not. He says he didn't, but, subconsciously, who knows. For one thing, if we go back to our nude models, for one thing, we have this woman who's staring at us. And she's not wide open and relaxed and showing herself. And there's some other examples of this too. You'll see the odalisque. That's one of them. But she is confronting our gaze. Oh, scandal. She's naked and she's looking right at us. She means business. And she is not afraid or not ashamed. And she's been cavorting with these fellows that are still clothed. Perhaps that's our interpretation. That's what the Academy is thinking. And she's a brazen woman because she's here with these clothed men. That's one issue. Another issue is that the atmospheric perspective or any kind of one-point perspective is really off here and strange. And this woman is kind of too large for where she should be in the painting. She is dwarfing this boat back here, and the composition is much like a Titian or a Raphael. I believe it's thought to be a combination of two paintings, which we don't have examples of in our book, but this whole composition and the way that they're portrayed was considered a thumbing his nose at the Academy. So she's not idealized. She looks a bit, rough in her skin and so on. She's not got this, obviously she looks amazing. But if we go back here, we think of this pale, pale flesh and this perfect pose and all that stuff, right? Compared to her, she does look a bit, exposed to the sunlight and a little bit fleshy and imperfect. And definitely she's looking at us. She may have been, we don't know, but she may have been an actual prostitute, and that was part of the scandal. So he was rejected from the salon, and so there were so many rejections. There were 3,000 paintings rejected in 1863 because artists are trying to do something different. So the Salon des Refuses rejected paintings. The rejected gallery was set up next to the salon. And this broke ground where, yes, there's this academy and it has strict rules, and the salon is going to show the paintings adhering to these rules. But then they decided, okay, we're going to allow you to do these other paintings, and we're not going, they're going to be shown as well, but not in the main space. So this is the beginning of modern art, believe it or not, 1863. And it's got to do with realism a little bit, the realistic figures. But it's also kind of the beginning of, sort of the beginning of Impressionism. Not exactly, but it is a groundbreaker for sure. Okay, so realism is something we're going to look at, and this is sort of thumbing one's nose also at neoclassicism, because the artists really are starting to want to show what's happening in the real world, not this idealized flesh or mythological things. It has to happen in real space. So modern subjects, and also the poor, and a lot of inequality for the poor. And we have Gustave Courbet, The Stonebreakers, absolutely stunning painting. And he shows the life of the Stonebreakers. The older gentleman is showing the younger gentleman what the rest of his life is going to be like and how to break stone. I don't know if you've ever seen anybody do anything remotely like this, but it's bone-jarring and horrible. It's just an awful, horrible job. But, when you had a designation, a class, a job that you did in the old days, as it were, but in the 19th century, for sure, and prior to that, that was it. You had that job. There wasn't any way to move up or change your position in the world. That was just it. So he's showing what these lives are like with the torn clothing and the brutality of it, right? This is very heavy, this basket of stones. And they're not facing us, and they're, how do you want to say, there's just a lot of detail here where you can see the harshness of their conditions. This also is 5 feet high by 6 feet wide, and ordinarily any kind of a genre painting, meaning a slice of life type painting, would be very, very small. It would be a matter of inches, and that might have been acceptable, but he creates controversy because he paints them so large. And he also coined the term realist. So this is kind of just showing their power and the unrelenting work that they have to do. Another one is the Gleaners, and this is Millet. And this shows some stratification. I find this a little bit hard to see, but here is the owner of the estate on his horse. Here are the main farmers over here with the main part of the crop. And then here are the lowest of the low, the gleaners that go in afterward and pick up the scraps and the leftovers of the hay or grain or whatever they're harvesting to get the last scraps, so maybe they could sell those or eat them or what have you. But what Millet does is he reverses the hierarchical scale. He puts these gleaners, these low people, gigantically large by comparison of the owner of the estate. So that is one aspect to this, very similar to Courbet in showing us these real